All right, myth visionaries, bring your criticisms, bring your tough questions. I have a heavy-hitting academic, Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald, is joining me today. Real quick, before we get started, I need to show you something. I want you to take a look at something with me here. This gentleman has kind of written something on the subject of Memetic criticism, dealing with the Gospels and Homer, Greek literature. And so I highly recommend you go and get you a copy if you can afford it. The works are enormous. They go from everything to Q scholarship all the way into Dionysus and Euripides and Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey. He's a classicist in his own right. And he's looking at the New Testament. And I am convinced that eclectic mimicism is the case. If there's something, I usually like tiptoe, right? I try to be cautious, but I am convinced that there is more to this than what people are saying in the academic guild. And I've had these conversations. I've seen some of the criticisms in the comments on the latest video with Dennis. And some of the people have said things that are like, no one accepts that. And they named Allison, right? Delcy Allison Jr., who says he doesn't know. He doesn't say it's wrong. He says, I don't know because I've been trained to only look at the Hebrew Bible. They mentioned Walsh, Robin Walsh. She actually does agree that this is what's going on, or they're maybe not on every pericope, but definitely believes that there's something going on here with the Greek imitation. Who else did they mention? Oh, Bart Ehrman. I went and visited him. He lives an hour and 10 minutes from me. I sat in his his office where his library is, and we talked, and he admits to me he's never read Dennis. So how can you say something's wrong? You've never read it or took the time to criticize. Well, you, the audience, have that opportunity today. Bring your questions, bring your super chats, and let's do it. So with that being said, I'm introducing a legend himself, Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald. How are you, my friend?
Oh, you're way too kind, and thank you. I'm doing all the better for all that glow you give me.
Look, you can write the check to... no, I'm just kidding. Seriously, let me first give a shout out to Vaguely Agnostic. Someone recommended not myth points, but myth money. So those who are early, get the myth money. I need you to jot down this so that you know when you go to the pearly gates and they ask you, like, under what circumstance are you allowed to enter the gates of heaven? You could pull out that myth money, and then they're going to see, and they're going to go, go ahead. Your mansion's over there. So you're totally good. Vaguely Agnostic, $1,000. Melody Joy, $500. And Daniel Hopkins, $250 in myth money. It is, you can cash it in. St. Peter knows all about it. Just let me know when you get to St. Peter. All right, Dennis, let's dive into this. I'm going to be a little funny, maybe even be critical purposefully to get you to get into your scholarly mode. But why don't you just pack up? Why don't you just pack up, give up, and just say, you know what? There's nothing to this. Some of these academics are not buying it. They haven't accepted this idea that the Greek world has played a huge part in the development of the New Testament. And they'll say, well, these I don't see the connections. There's wishful thinking, parallelomania, et cetera, et cetera. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think Galileo should have just packed up and not told people what he saw in his telescope. I think Darwin should just have packed up and not told people what he saw on the islands. I'm not making this up, Derek, and I'm not trying to featherbed my income, because I'm getting no income from any of this, as far as I can tell, except, modest things from the books. These things are there. And I know that I'm a pioneer, but pioneers often get things wrong originally. And I'm waiting for the settlers to come in and to correct some of the excesses that may be there in my work. So what I'm trying to do is to help the Pope look through my telescope and to see the stars as Galileo saw them. That is, these are things that are there, comparisons that have been inconvenient truths to Christian believers and to scholars alike. And I just want to put the inconvenient truths out there in front of them and your viewers to have them decide which ones are compelling, which ones may not be compelling. What is the relationship between literary creativity and historicity or theology? And I'm not interested in the historical or the theological issues very much, though the literary judgments do impact how one thinks about things theologically and historically. We can talk about that at some point. So, yeah, I can't pack it up because I'd be unfaithful to what I'm seeing through the telescope or in the Galapagos Islands or whatever. So,
you're like Martin Luther standing before that council and they say, recant. And you say,
I can do no other.
I can't.
I can do no other. I'm just trying to describe what I see.
Awesome. Well, I've got a couple of super chats here. Jason Anderson, thank you, my friend. Always seeing you come in with a super sticker, showing support. I appreciate it. You have wings. You just don't see them yet, but they're there. I really appreciate that, man. Doc Pluromanaut, thank you. We were messaging last night on Patreon. For those who haven't joined, consider doing so. Always intelligent questions. So, Dennis, here we are. And by the way, for those who get offended, if I don't call him doctor, I've called him doctor a million times, and he finally said, "You're my friend, so call me Dennis." And yes, so I want to publicly make that aware, because some people actually do get very irritated if I'm very friendly and not being formal. How much are we seeing theophany and delayed recognition scenes in Luke 24, particularly Cleopas' misunderstanding of Jesus' teachings, resembling Nestor's misidentification of Athena as mentor? Ooh, he's read a little bit.
Oh, no, that's a great question. And in fact, the theophany is, for your other viewers, means the visitation of a god as a stranger, or the treating of the appearance of a god as a stranger. Actually, you have lots of theophanies, and other scholars have argued, and I don't disagree, that the literary motif of the visitation of a deity is a part of the literary background that Luke is developing. But I think that you can say that already in Homer, you have Odysseus playing the role of a deity who's being recognized. The recognition of Athena, the misidentification of Athena as mentor by Nestor, is only one of a number of such misidentifications that you have in the Odyssey. In fact, it's a major trope. So this question is really a brilliant one, and it shows that this idea of having misidentification or secret identities, the gods coming out in disguise and so on, is all over the place, especially in the Odyssey, where you have issues of secrecy and misinterpretation and so on. So good for you. I mean, you have it in the Hebrew Bible too, where angels are identified as strangers, or and so on.
Well put. Thank you, Doc, for that super chat, and of course all that support. You're always coming in with clever questions, and so I really do want to say thank you. I appreciate it. Neophyte One has another one. Thank you so much for the super chat. Dr. MacDonald, thank you for your contribution to scholarship. Your impact is permanent and will be felt for generations to come. Derek, thank you too. Thank you so much.
Oh, how encouraging is that? And one reason that the impact will be permanent is not because of my books, but it's because of social media. And Derek is really the pioneer for me in all of this, and these things are not going away. But I want to say one more piece. I have a new 2-volume work that's being called Epic, Tragedy, and Gospel, or Gospels. And the first is a synopsis of the synoptic gospels that I'm calling Memetic synopsis, because it includes my translations of the likely targets in Greek poetry. The second volume, to be bound with the third, but the second volume is called a syncresis in the Acts of the Apostles. So it's not a synopsis, but it's a comparison of the Acts of the Apostles, first with the Iliad, then the Odyssey, and the Bacchae, to show the similar characterizations and episodes. The third volume is, believe it or not, a synopsis of 3 Gospels of John, where I unbraid the 3 compositional layers that inform the fourth Gospel, and argue that the earliest of them is a Christian, portrays Jesus as a new Dionysus in competition with Euripides' Bacchae. So the reason this is an answer to your question is to make of the first 6 months of publications a PDF. And the first 6 months, it will be available for each volume for under $50, maybe well under $50, in hard copy.
If I may, Dennis, just so our audience knows, like, if you compile all his works that he has done, and by the way, your Amazon page needs to be updated. I wish someone could go in there and add the other books that are not up here, like Mythologizing Jesus, I see is missing. Luke and Virgil, I don't see it on your Amazon page, but if you go back, you just type in Dennis MacDonald, you can go down and find like Mythologizing Jesus. I actually teared up at the end of this book. It was just so beautiful. But yeah, he takes all of these. I mean, the Acts of Andrew, you name it. Let me just show again on the screen. Like, he takes all of these books and he squeezes them into a couple volumes and added material that is not in these books. So it's updated, new stuff, and then makes it affordable. So that's the whole goal. So that if you can afford it, help support. Aren't you trying to do something where people can actually support? We need to get that link somehow so people can. I got your email. Your email's
okay,
there.
Okay. Well, there's a nonprofit that is willing to offer tax-deductible verification if people wish to donate. Any donation over $200 guarantees a signed copy of both of the synopses. Is soon out. So that would be very much appreciated. But I want to say one more thing. When Darwin finished his Origin of Species in the first edition, he was skeptical that his theory of evolution would have any purchase. And he thought it's only going to be in the younger generation where where evolution is going to take place. Now, he was wrong. So very soon, because of the compelling nature of his data, people accepted the evolutionary hypothesis. But if this business is going to have any traction, it's going to have to be the younger generation. Derek, it's going to be your generation and younger who are going to have to do it, because there's so much inertia in the church and in academia that it's very much like a self-basting turkey, if I could put it that way. So, you repeat the problems because there's a disciplinary matrix that protects itself. And the kinds of unconventional data that I'm throwing out there is really not warmly received, because it's hard to digest in terms of the regnant paradigms.
Yeah, this is tough. We've got some super chats. I think this will get us as we go. I really wanted to plug it. I know you probably didn't want to get into the advertisement. I do have another separate clip I'm going to play at some point and publish it, because I am a believer in what you're doing, even if every pericope you bring up isn't the case. So I say that just for our audience to understand, like, let's be skeptical, let's see if Dennis is right. If he's not, and you think, nah, Dennis, I'm sorry, I just don't follow you on that one. He's okay with that. But the fact that it's completely ignored, there's a huge red flag to me. So thank you, Neophyte One, again. I'm going to keep chipping away at these super chats, and Dennis will get your answers. Dr. MacDonald, were the practices of mimesis and rewriting only used in writing myth, or do we have examples of it being implemented in history writing?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And in fact, probably imitations of poetry and myth was the least important form of mimesis. And the reason is that people learn to write in order to be lawyers and judges and to be in the legal system. And in order to do that, they needed to learn how to take examples of rhetoric and defenses that are used in law courts and imitate them so that they, when they are faced with a legal struggle, they know how to create invective, that is, to diminish the opponent's credibility, or encomium, which is a way of giving credit to your client. And Quintilian, for example, has many categories of ancient genres. Some are poetry, but we also have history, we have fables, and so on. And there are examples then given. If you want to write a fable, let me give you some stories of Aesop and go for it. If you want to write a sea adventure, either historical or not, here are the ways of doing it. And so that you can take the sea adventures in the Odyssey to do it, but there are other sea adventures you can use too. A famous one is called syncresis, where students are told how to compare two characters and to show that one is better than the other, or in fact that one is good and the other is bad, a combination of invective and it. So
Dennis, just so people know what you're saying, this is ancient world, because someone might not understand the context. You're talking about this is how they wrote in the ancient world.
That's right.
Just want to emphasize that as you continue. I'm sorry I interrupted. I just want our
audience
to...
No, that's right. But mimesis is characteristic of literary imitation and composition in multiple genres. So if you want to write a history, you imitate Herodotus or Xenophon. If you want to write a declamation, you imitate Demosthenes or Lysias. If you want to write a fable, you imitate Aesop. So it really is pervasive in literary composition and so on. And so your question is right on target. It's important to see that mimesis is not simply rewriting mythology. It's rewriting anything that's successful that can help your career.
Excellent question. MG Harris, good to see you. I really appreciate you giving a super chat, and always wonderful seeing you on Facebook and the groups and learning more. Hi, Dennis and Derek. Thanks for amazing content. Did anyone in history notice parallels between Greco-Roman literature and the Gospels? Great question.
Yes. Excellent question. Now, most did not, of course, and that is still the case. But we do know, especially in the Eastern Church, where Homer and Euripides were still available and read, that people, in fact, rewrote gospel stories using lines from Homer to do so. So, for example, when they rewrite the story of Polyphemus, of the story of the Gerasene demoniac and Jesus turning soldiers into swine, they use lines from Homer about Polyphemus. In fact, there are 13 lines that are used to describe the cave island where the Gerasene demoniac lives that are exactly the same lines that Homer uses. Or when you have Jesus turning soldiers into swine, the lines are from Circe turning the soldiers into swine. And it goes on and on. Now, unfortunately, these Homeric centones are not widely available, and in many cases, not even translated. So my volumes have, in some cases, the first English translations of these passages that rewrite the Gospels using the Homeric lines that first inform them. The same thing is even more true with the fourth Gospel. The fourth Gospel was understood to be a Dionysian Gospel. In the 5th century, an Egyptian poet named Nonus, who was also a believer in Dionysus, wrote a paraphrase of the fourth Gospel in which it's called a paraphrase of the Gospel of John. And there, Jesus has traits from Dionysus and occasionally imitations from the Bacchae. But we do have imitations of the Bacchae also in the Orthodox Gospel of Nicodemus. We have them in the Orthodox Acts of Andrew. And it's clear that people saw these similarities. Now, did they think these similarities meant that the gospel authors imitated Greek and Roman or Roman literature? I don't think so, actually. I think they saw the similarities, but they weren't probably willing to say that these are not historical stories. They're just embellishing them by using poetry to do so. And of course, they do make them more beautiful. But I'm not sure that they're fans of mimesis. I wish they could be in our chat and tell us what they think, but they're not going to do it.
Yeah, this it's just a really interesting historical question, I think, that she's asking, and it really is necessary, because you have to ask, like, did people in history think there was some type of connection? I mean, and if we could see that, that adds value to what you're doing. So it's not like this is completely missing from history. Real quick,
one more little
while you
tag
do that,
on
I'm grabbing your little folder, by the way, real quick. Go ahead.
Okay. One more tag on that, Derek, is that these recognitions happen already in the 2nd century. Justin Martyr compares Jesus to Asclepius and to Dionysus and to Heracles. Clement of Alexandria has Christ himself appealing to Dionysus to convert to his religion and to give up his own by really paraphrasing the opening monologue of the Bacchae. So there can't be any doubt that early Christians saw these similarities, and in some cases they were threatened by them. One of the texts of antiquity that is poorly understood, I think, in modern scholarship is the Protrepticus of Clement of Alexandria. And the Protrepticus means, a Protrepticus is an preliminary introduction to philosophy. And it's a way of providing a primer to the Christian philosophy that Clement explores in his other works. But it is a repository of quotations from Greek authors, especially poetry, some of which is now lost. And he does so because he wants his pagan readers to be engaged with their own religion and to see that the Christian religion is superior, or at least not inferior. So these similarities were very clear among early Christian intellectuals, not the basic reader. By the way, the Acts of Andrew ends with a wonderful postscript that says, I'm going to end my text here. I hope that I heard everything as I should have. And I hope my readers get both the obvious and also the hidden that is available only to the intellect. That is, the text functions at 2 levels, one for the general believer and the other for the intellectual. And I think some of these texts are written with kind of 2 audiences in mind, the hoi polloi and the hoi pepet of many, the educated.
Wow. So just common sense tells me, and we're gonna get to the next super chat, that if you're going to engage in a world of pagans, right, you're going to make an impact, you have to compete. And if you want to win, you've got to show why yours is better. You can't do that ignoring that world in which you live in, the Greco-Roman world, where every corner has an Asclepius temple, and you can go and get your healings from him. And every time you turn around, there's a wine god of Dionysus, and Zeus is throwing thunderbolts or whatever, like you got to compete, and Jesus sure does. All right, next question. Neophyte one. Do we have any insight on how the ancients understood the genre of myth versus history? Were they understood literally?
That again is a very good question, and classicists have worked with that quite a bit. I think it differs, though, from text to text. When it comes to Homer, there's almost no historical information that we can tease out, although we do know that there was a destruction of Troy that has been excavated. But virtually all of the characters that as far as we can tell, the characters in the Odyssey were mythological. Some of them from the catalog of ships in Iliad Book 2 may be historical. But when we get to Virgil, it's quite amazing that Virgil obviously is writing a myth of Aeneas and the founding of Rome, but at several points, he becomes a historian. He's using Livy, he's using Ennius, he's using other Latin authors. And Roman historians sometimes use Virgil's Aeneid, though it's a mythology, in order to reconstruct history. So the question also is very strong in making the point that just because something is myth does not mean it is not history. That just because you have a mythologized narrative doesn't mean there's nothing behind it. Let me give you an example. I don't think there was a Joseph of Arimathea. He plays the role of Priam in the Iliad, who's burying the body of his son. And in Greek, Arimathea would be heard as excellent discipleship. And so it's not Jesus's father, Joseph of Nazareth, who buries Jesus, but his namesake, Joseph of Arimathea. Now, does that mean that Jesus was never buried? No. Presumably he was buried. Was the name Joseph? I doubt it, but it's not impossible. So people have argued that my work means that everything in the Gospels is mythology, including Jesus himself, as mythicists would have it. No, these historical characters get mythologized, sometimes beyond recognition, but nonetheless, one can tease out historical information by being careful. Other characters, of course, do get created. So one should not misunderstand Mimesis criticism as being anti-historical. It, in fact, is enriched history because you're trying to understand the historical situations that produced the mimesis, right? What is the historical situation of the authors and how much information is reliable that they're using? A good example of this is in the Acts of the Apostles, where the author clearly knows some of Paul's epistles and adds things to them that probably are historical. On the other hand, there are large stretches of the book that are based on mythology. So one has to have criteria to determine, when you look at these mythological narratives, how to press back into the tradition and even into historical memory.
So this, I mean, it's a valid point we're bringing up. And if we were to take things in the ancient world, let's put it this way. They weren't writing everything the way we would want to analyze history today. There's a whole different style. So there's another thing we got to look at. It's anachronistic to assume, well, we got it right and they got it wrong. It's just understanding how they wrote things is going to help us, I think, in when we're approaching this literature.
Yes, and how they read things. So that there's a part of the question I didn't answer. Most Greeks thought that what they read in Homer was history. Okay. Now, not all did, and there were skeptics and so on, but there were defenders of the historicity of the Homeric epics too.
And this is what we see with the Gospels. Like early Christians believed what they were reading was history for the most part, that this was true, right?
I don't think so, honestly. I think the earliest readers of the Gospels knew that they were being competitive with Greco-Roman society. But of course, not all would have had that sophistication.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate you answering that. Doc Pleroma, thank you for the super chat, my friend. Is this Ezekiel, I think? 3227 gives a telling, albeit brief, description of the Gibborim. But these heroic fallen warriors contradict the Genesis 6 context as flawed characters. Are we seeing infused classicism?
Well, I'm not quite sure what the question means, but what one can say is that Genesis 6 and the coming of the angels copulating with mortal women and producing giants was even recognized by Philo as very similar to the Gigantomachy, that is the battle of the giants in Greek mythology. So I don't know if that's where your caller is talking. I don't know that. Yeah, I just don't know how to answer it.
Yeah, giving a brief, albeit brief, description of the Gibborim, but these heroic fallen warriors contradict the Genesis 6 context as flawed characters. Are we seeing infused classicism? Just to read that passage, Ezekiel, this is Ezekiel 32:27. I'll read 27. And they do not lie with the fallen mighty men of old who went down to Sheol with their weapons of war, whose swords were laid under their heads and whose shields are upon their bones. For the terror of the mighty men was in the land of the living. So you shall be broken and lie among the uncircumcised with those who are slain by the sword, etc. So don't know. Maybe
that could be a good echo. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
If it is, when would you place the dating of Ezekiel at this point? During sometime during the Hellenistic period, probably.
I'm not an authority on it. I'm sorry.
Right. And I know you don't want to answer. It just makes you wonder. I mean, maybe they had contact before then. That's another interesting question to ask. So, yeah. Doc, this one was even over our heads somewhat. And thank you so much for the wonderful super chat, my friend. Chris, thank you for the super chat. Any chance Mark's gospel was just a student's homework using Homer, Old Testament, and techniques like intercalation, parables to write a fictional Jesus story?
Oh, I don't think there's a chance of it, but I can say why I think Chris is going to want to think of it this way. Mark's Greek is really quite pedestrian, and you can see it most clearly when you compare Mark and Luke, where Luke is really much more sophisticated in his rhetorical skill. But no, it's not just student homework. It really is brilliantly narrated. If it were a student, I'd love to have that student in a graduate program here and write a dissertation, because the sophistication is so amazing. The secret identity of Jesus, the revelation to his closest comrades, the use of significant names. No, he is And he's not trying simply to write an exercise to impress a teacher. He's trying to help people who have been suffering from the Jewish war to make sense of suffering. Jesus's crucifixion ends in resurrection. He invites people to take up their own crosses and follow him, and says that there are going to be rewards for you if you go through this suffering, and so on. No, the stakes for the author of the Gospel of Mark are huge, and they're tragic and compassionate and sophisticated, not just in literature, but also in theological perspective. So it's a clever question, and we still don't know quite why Mark was so bad with participles. We wish he'd have been better with participles, but in terms of rewriting mythology, he really was brilliant.
Thank you so much for the question, Chris. Always a good one. Neophyte One says, are there examples of mimesis and rewriting among Semitic Jews, or was it a phenomena among Hellenistic cultures only?
What another wonderful question. Jews rewrote their scriptures both in Greek and in Semitic languages. Think of Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, where he clearly is rewriting and imitating, let's say, Deuteronomy or the Deuteronomistic histories and so on. So yes, we have it there, but we also in the Semitic world call it midrash. Now, midrash is a wide range of rewritten strategies that often juxtapose two biblical texts to interpret each other as both of the Word of God, and then to examine them, compare them, and to come up with a theological or an ethical judgment. So I have long wanted to get Semitic experts and Greek experts together for a conference to be called Midrash and Mimesis, because I think you have both of them going on. It happens more clearly among Greeks, because this is how they were taught in schools. But it's clear that in schools of rabbinic learning, you had a different kind of rewriting and flexibility of narrative. So much so that, in fact, there at Qumran, we have several different versions of Deuteronomy. And they're not just different versions, they actually are rewritings. The so-called Temple Scroll is a rewriting largely of Deuteronomy, in which Moses plays a minimal or a negligible role. And it adds lots of legislation, it deletes some, but it's clearly a rewriting of Deuteronomy. So this is something that happens in ancient literature frequently, both among Jews in Semitic languages and in Greek languages, but also among Gentiles.
Thank you so much for that. That was really good question.
Excellent question.
My buddy Eddie at Brute Facts Podcast, go subscribe to him. Love you, brother. Thank you for the super chat. How does typological prophecy fit? Also, why are people reluctant to acknowledge mythology and mythology inspiration in scripture? Derek.
Okay, those are two questions. Typological prophecy is a problem whether you hold to mimesis criticism or not. So the typological prophecy means that you take the prophecy and you abstract it into some typos, some type, right, some pattern, and then you can see that that pattern gets fit in some other way. Now, it's possible that the person who is writing this for us is saying that it demonstrates that typological prophecy is a part of the Memetic project. that people see certain things in their texts. They see them as typoi, or as types, or as abstractions, and that Jesus nicely fits into that given the rewriting process. So that's possible. Why are people reluctant to acknowledge mythology in the inspiration of Scripture? I think I'm going to give two answers. One is an answer for believers, and another is an answer for academics. And of course, there are people who are both. For believers, I think that there's a misunderstanding of mythology as falsehood instead of as truth done in narrative. And we need to have a more robust understanding that mythology doesn't mean falsehood, but it actually means truth of a certain kind. And in the Western world, we are so oriented towards science and understanding, after the Enlightenment, that we try to get rid of mythology is so much nonsense because it's not scientific. But I would say mythology is a better host for true meaning of life than science. So we need to have a more robust understanding of the virtues of mythology. I think among scholars, the problem is that there has been an interest in making early Christian texts distinctive from its environment, especially from the Greco-Roman environment. And of course, there are differences. Greco-Roman mythology is polytheistic. Its heroes are flawed characters. They have human lusts and greed and so on. And what happens in the New Testament is a nice Platonic washing of these characters with virtue, so they no longer have the mythological vices. But these overlapping texts that we've been talking about on your MythVision seem not to be legitimate because Jesus is virtuous and these other parallels to characters are those parallels are immoral. Well, that's the whole point. You're trying to make Jesus more of a platonically. Yeah. So there's that would be my answer, I guess.
Wonderful answer. Because when I first started this show and I called this MythVision, it was not Mythicist Vision, it was MythVision. I love a story. Science is science, and you can interpret it as a story if you'd like, but it isn't a story. We humans love stories. So don't get me started on getting excited here, but I think mythology is an amazing way to convey lessons of truth that are applicable to the world around us. And we all have them. We all look at this stuff every day in our life. So I love the way you said that. And I think this is common ground that Christians and non-believers can meet. But
yes, I agree with you.
I think it's the fundamentalism that becomes an issue that causes a war-like ideological war between both groups. That's the problem.
Let me give you just another historical note. Plato does not like Homeric myths. And he has passages in which he encourages nurses not to tell such stories of mythology to children. Because what warrior would want to die on the battlefield if the greatest of all warriors, Achilles, would rather be a slave on earth than the king of all the dead, and so on. But at several points, when Plato wants to make a philosophical point, often with higher ethical values in play, he creates his own myth. So you have myths of the netherworld in the Phaedo and the Gorgias. And the whole point is avoid vice because you're going to be punished for it in the afterlife and so on. So myth has in it resident ethical and philosophical possibilities.
Yeah, well put. We got a lot of super chats. Try and catch up here. I love talking with you. You know that, Dennis. We really are get into this stuff. So, all right, Samuel Chen, thank you for the super chat. Really do appreciate the support. Could we hear examples, comparison of the moral teachings of Greek stories and how via mimesis those moral teachings are transvalued by New Testament authors? Also, examples of mimesis Dr. MacDonald rejects and why. Thank you. Ooh.
I'm going to start with the last one and then have to think a little more about the first part of it. There are lots of examples of mimesis that I reject, including many that I had entertained myself and now reject. So I can give you some examples of that. But the reason I reject examples of mimesis is if they fail to satisfy 3 of the 7 criteria of mimesis. Very briefly, accessibility. Yeah, accessibility. Was the antecedent text available? 2 is analogy. Did other people similarly imitate that example? Are the then criteria 3, 4, and 5? Are the parallels dense? Are they sequential? And are they distinctive? Are there flags in the text that tell you that you have this borrowing going on? Then the 6th is interpretability. What is to be gained in viewing one text as an imitation of another? And the 7th is, did people in antiquity understand and recognize these imitations? So in order to make these judgments about literary imitation, and by the way, this is true even if you want to compare newspaper articles. You know, is somebody plagiarizing another? Well, was it available? Are other people imitating it? Are the parallels dense? And so I use those criteria myself to evaluate plagiarism, for example. So these are kind of intuitive. So if parallels are brought to my attention that satisfy at least 3 of those criteria, then I think, yeah, let's go with it. Let's see what we can do with it. But it also has to be interpretable. What is to be gained by saying that one text is borrowing from another? Because usually the translation has a bone to pick with the model, either to show that Jesus or Paul or whatever is like a character or is better than a character. But if it's just to say that they've got some similarities, that doesn't seem to work.
Yeah.
Now, let me read this. Could we hear examples or comparisons of the moral teachings of Greek stories and how via mimesis those moral teachings are transvalued?
You know what came to mind, and this may be a bad connection, is showing when Dionysus is not showing mercy, which is an attribute of Dionysus, wrath, where Jesus literally does the most noble and like you would not expect by showing mercy to his enemies in this situation with Paul, where, you know, he literally shows him mercy and does not kill him, whereas Pentheus is destroyed. And I was thinking the value lesson there, but that might not be a good example because it's not really using the same value. It's kind of reversing the scenario. I don't know.
Here's one that may not be clear to you and your audience, but it's pretty clear to me if you read some Aristotle. In the Odyssey, Eurycleia is washing a beggar's feet and recognizes from the scar on his feet that it's actually her master. And then she says, you are Odysseus, returned home. And Odysseus says, don't tell anybody, because if you tell them, the suitors will kill me. This is the background, in my view, to the story of the woman who anoints Jesus' feet and recognizes that he's going to die. Now, Aristotle wrote quite a bit about this story in the Odyssey, because that story of recognition, called anagonismus, appears in Greek tragedy also, in Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, all three. And he says that some of those recognition scenes are trivial, but the one in the Odyssey is magnificent because a scar is such a distinctive marker. But he said that the greatest form of recognition of all is when there are no signs and one recognizes who one is by their virtues without having to have a visible sign. Well, this is what happens in the Gospel of Mark. The woman recognizes and anoints Jesus for his burial, even though there's no physical mark that's going to indicate that he's about to die. The disciples, of course, still think Jesus is not going to perish on a cross. So it's marginal character who recognizes without a sign that Jesus is about to die. And that's her credit. That's why wherever the gospel is preached, what she has done will be remembered. So, but there are other examples of the comparison of what some ancients would have considered moral virtues, such as killing the suitors, slaying the suitors. That's all justified because the suitors are so criminal and they've had their chance and the gods are supporting them. Well, when Jesus cast people out of the temple, that's potentially a parallel to the clearing of the house of Odysseus. He doesn't kill anybody. He just says that you've made my temple, my father's house, a den of thieves. So he's pursuing righteousness, but he's not killing anybody. And apparently, he doesn't even hurt them. So.
Yeah, we got to keep going, but someone might actually say, that there's a clear Hebrew Bible connection here, and that's where eclectic Mimetism is something that is necessary to understand. It isn't either or.
Right.
They're far more sophisticated than that. They understand the narrative of the Greco-Roman world and the Jewish scripture. Vesna, thank you for the super chat. I really appreciate it. Gospels say memory, not fame. Please defend Euryclea. CNXN. I think that's defend Euryclea.
Yeah, I understand.
I think this is a criticism saying it's memory, not fame. I don't know.
It's not even memory, and it's not fame either. Wherever the gospel is preached, what she has done will be. Well, I can get the Greek text out right here.
Watching him reading Greek on camera, ladies and gentlemen, having fun.
Okay. Oh, yes, okay. Had epois en afti la lestatai is nemesun en aftis. No, nemesun. It will be done in her memory. But what else is memory but her widespread fame? So wherever the gospel is preached in the entire world, I mean, she will be remembered. I mean, that's fame as far as I can tell.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a pun, like you said, on this whole Euryclea washing the feet of Odysseus. I think it's interesting. Thank you for that. Sentinel Apologetics. Appreciate you, Rob. I appreciate your super chat, my friend. It says Carl Sandnes, Sandnes, in 2011 wrote to you, the nature of the centos makes it impossible to perceive them or their genre as in any way being a source or inspiration for the composition of the canonical Gospels.
Yes, that's a famous book. Actually, I wrote a review of it, and I can tell you what the review says. But Carl came up to me, went out of his way to come up to me at a professional conference and said, "Thank you so much for the review." And he said, basically, I agree with your assessment. Most of my review was very positive. And I think what the Centos are doing are different from what the Gospels are doing. And I tried to make that clearer in the book. But my biggest criticism of him, and which he apparently agreed with, is that there are certain places where the Centuists have extended imitations of Homer to retell gospel stories. In some cases, 11 lines, in other cases, 13 lines, in some cases, just 4 or 5 lines. But to have those lines together used to retell the story of a period in the Gospels that I think originally used them or imitated them cannot be by accident. Now, I said before already in our chat that I don't think that the Homeric Centones authors believed in mimesis criticism, but I think Insanus is right that the parallels were indistinguishable to ancient readers, and the Homeric Centones and certainly the Gospel of Nicodemus make it clear that they did see similarities. Sanus is a articulate critic. He's a classicist too. And I respect his work, and I actually think you ought to read his stuff. But as far as I know, he agrees with my judgment that at certain cases, and I'm talking about maybe 10, 12 cases, where we have these extended imitations, the authors must have seen the similarities and used them. In one case, in fact, it was the Homeric Centones that helped me understand the origin, it helped me find the parallels. And so I started with the Centones, and then I said, "Oh, I wonder if that's a valid parallel." And dang, if it wasn't clear. I can tell you what it is at some point. Is the woman who? Well, I'll tell you now. The woman with the hemorrhage that Jesus heals. That story gets retold by using lines out of Apollo's healing of Glaucus in the Iliad.
Thank you, Rob, for that super chat. Wonderful question.
Yep,
I love when I see some criticism stuff too, to get we're all learning. We're trying to figure this out. So thank you. Susie Bailey, thank you so much for the super sticker. I really appreciate that. Didn't see a question. Hold on. Nope. We got a comment here. Love me some Dr. MacDonald. He's deep. I've been reading the same book for what feels like 5 years. That's awesome. Derek, thank you so much. I appreciate you, Susie. I really appreciate that wonderful comment. Yeah, I mean, I could start right now and probably wouldn't finish in 5 years. I mean, especially that 2 shipwreck gospel. Goodness gracious. Thank you so much, Susie, for the super chat and the love and the support. And Brute, love you, man. Thank you so much, everybody. Neophyte 1, is it more appropriate to understand the Gospels as texts written by elites to persuade other elites in the Intelligentsia, I think it is, rather than for churches? Thank you for that super chat.
Robin Faith Walsh has written an important book, and she argues that it is written by elites for elites. And I think her work is especially helpful in understanding the history of the discipline, because the discipline was really informed to a large extent by 19th century Romanticism, German Romanticism. On the other hand, we know early on that these texts were in fact read in congregations, and that not everyone in the congregation, in fact it would be a minority, would have been among the educated elites. But they would have been aware of the Greek culture around them, the statuary, the mythologies, and so on. So it's a really important question. I think in the history of the discipline, Unfortunately, scholars have dumbed down the evangelists in order to make themselves look smarter. Actually, I think the gospel authors were, in terms of cultural terms, much smarter than we are. And they knew intimately the books that they were evoking in order to craft their new social identities by creating these mythologies. So, but obviously the books became very popular early on, or were used to identify various communities. And so they did have traction among others other than the intelligentsia. Now, for mimesis fully to be appreciated, though, people would have to be educated. That's true.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to show everybody the book. I'm letting everybody know. I just wrote this in the chat. You can super chat if you want. We won't have any time for more questions than the ones we already have that we need to go through, because I can't keep Dennis on here forever. So, you know, if you want to show love, feel free to. I will give a shout out and I'll read it. But going through questions, you know, he's going to want to go through those questions, and he doesn't like to just give you sorry answers. He really wants to give you. I know Dennis too well. So moving on, Donnie Springer, thank you so much for that super chat. Matthew 10, the narrative of this chapter seems like it may have originally been a post-resurrection appearance, narrative comp with parousia, i.e. coming prior to the completion of the mission to Israel. Thoughts?
Matthew 10 is a masterpiece. But to understand Matthew 10, one also has to understand the Q document. And I, at this point, would want to say that Q is not a mirage. I do not agree with standard Q reconstructions, and that's why I have different criteria and I have a different understanding of the Q document. But Matthew 10 is a masterpiece of putting things together from Mark and from another document. Now, I don't think that document was a post-resurrection appearance narrative. I think it actually was, and by the way, for your viewers, Matthew 10 is the place where Jesus gives the commission to the 12 to go out on a mission. And it's full of warnings about suffering and carrying your burdens and, sacrificing for the mission and so on. But I just want to say, so I just think it's a masterpiece. I don't think it's the appearance narrative. Rather, I think it's a beautiful blending of Mark and the Q document. But just one other thing for my Q skeptics. I've done this, actually. Go through the Gospel of Luke, and you can do it in English or German or whatever you wish, and block out everything that you think could be attributed to mythology, to Greek mythology. Even if you don't know Greek mythology very well, you could just take the miraculous pieces and get rid of them. And look at what's left, and then compare what's left to Mark and Matthew, and you'll see that often Luke is more primitive than Mark and Matthew, which he no doubt, in my view, no doubt knew. Now, how do you explain that? You explain it by talking about a lost gospel. Probably the gospel was known by Papias and Luke himself when he talks about many have undertaken to write a narrative of things that have happened among us. So Matthew 10's a beautiful example. I don't think it's post-resurrection appearance. I think it's a sophisticated rewriting of the mission speech in the Lost Gospel.
Thank you so much. Just a shout out, everybody. We're going to end at ScholarVid Super Chat for questions. If you want to support, you can. It's just I don't want him to be on forever. I value Dennis's time, and I really appreciate the support, though. So next question is free thought. Is there a way to trace the shift from El to Yah by looking at names like Ezekiel, Michael, Israel, for an earlier worship of El, and later transferring to Yah and getting Isaiah, Jeremiah, Elijah?
Well, whoever free thought is smarter on that question than I am. I really can't weigh in on it. Sorry, pal.
So this is a good question. Just to get like someone who's a maybe documentary hypothesis. Joel Baden might be a guy to consider. Email me, Derek@MythVisionPodcast.com. I like to ask Hebrew scholars this question, if they're critical scholars, and just to see what they have to say about the names and where this may play a role in that. So thank you for that. Lou Core, thank you for the super chat. In John 2:1-11, Cana miracle, Mary bosses the servants around. Jesus turns water into wine. What Greco-Roman myth do you think this story is emulating?
It's certainly Euripides, Bacchae, in terms not of the narrative structure, but turning water into wine is something that Dionysus does. He produces water, he produces wine. The Cana miracle also needs to be twinned with the Samaritan woman narrative, where Jesus is giving her living water. This business about Mary bossing the servants around is really pretty clever. You don't have really, the narrative parallels are not as clear as the basic mythic pattern. But you do have a fascinating possibility in Achilles Tatius's Leucippe and Clitophon. It's a novel in which a couple who are about to be married. It's a love scene. Have a discussion about how wine was discovered. And Dionysus in disguise, this goes back to the secrecy and recognition piece. Dionysus in disguise goes to a farm, and the farmer gives a wonderful meal, but there's no wine. And Dionysus turns the water into wine, and the farmer says, "Hey, where did you get this marvelous wine? It's like blood." And Dionysus then tells them that he reveals his identity. And so this is the origin of wine. Well, several scholars have suggested that actually Achilles Tatius seems to have read the Gospel of John and used that motif to write his own version of the myth. So in this case, you might say that a Greco-Roman author is reading the Gospels instead of the Gospels reading the Bacchae. But even in antiquity, Lou, you have people who recognize that this was a Dionysian act, even though the narrative structure is a bit different.
There's so much to get into. You write in your book, in this particular book, you point out an example how they would put the water jars in the temple, 3 of them, and the next morning they come back and wouldn't you know it, they're all wine. And I do think it's kind of interesting. I wonder if the author is doubling what the Dionysian practice was, saying we're twice as good. There are 6.
Oh, and huge, huge containers. Yeah, that's right.
It could also play a significant role in creation. 6 days, there's a new man. It's not the same as the Genesis scenario, but a new man. There might be levels to this, layers to this, because the composition they're far more intelligent than I think we give credit to them for. So there's a lot here, and thank you so much, Lou. Doc Pleroma, thank you for the super chat. How do scholarly efforts of demythologization, like Rudolph Bhutmon, hinder or help the historical pursuit of the New Testament given memetic realities and theological biases?
What a wonderful question. Bhutmon's last student was Helmut Kester. Helmut Kester was on my dissertation committee at Harvard. And I started out as a true believer in the Bhutmon-Kester understanding of the history of the tradition. And Bhutmon's most famous book in this regard is The History of the Synoptic Tradition. I have patterned my career as a way of crafting an alternative history of the Synoptic tradition that undoes Bhutmon. I actually think Bhutmon was brilliant, but he allowed us to it's many problems there. One is I'm after the re-mythologizing of the gospel stories, not the demythologizing of them to certain kinds of theological or ethical or psychological patterns. So I'd like to re-mythologize. The other is he gives the impression that the gospels come out of oral transmission, the folk traditions. This is the German romanticism that Robin Walsh talks about. Instead of seeing that, in fact, these are written by intellectuals who are engaging their culture with a counter mythology, and the truth of these myths is in the retelling of the myth, not in getting rid of the myth by using certain kinds of Platonic archetypes.
Doc, message me on my Patreon when we're done. You're blowing me away with these questions.
That was a great question. Yeah. Really important.
Really, just well read. Thank you, Doc. Brute Facts Podcast. Eddie, thank you, my friend. Says, thank you, good doctor, for your time and great info.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Hey, I'm telling you, you've got critics, but some of the critics are even fans. So, Dennis, we got to do this more often, honestly. Joseph Rotoni, I hope Rotoni, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name. Thank you for that super chat. After spending time with Dr. Carrier, do you think the Jesus myth theory has more credence than you previously thought? Do you at least think it should be debated more? Example, Carrier versus Ehrman, Dr. Ehrman.
Well, I have my issues with both friends, Carrier and Ehrman, so I come out a little differently on that debate. No, I don't think. I think we should abandon the Jesus myth theory for lots of reasons. Richard and I have talked about this. I think, again, I would say it's very difficult to explain what we have in the Gospels in terms of the engagement with Judaism, the debates with Pharisees, the imitations of the Jewish Bible, by just simply talking about myth. So I'm a big fan of the mythologizing of Jesus, but not the myth of Jesus. And so what I'm doing in my books is assuming that there's a historical Jesus who is largely unrecoverable, because whoever he was so important to people that they mythologized him to make him compete with the likes of Odysseus and Hector and Aeneas.
There's so much to this. An example, just for our audience, Elvis. Very important figure, so much so he thought so of himself. He said, maybe I'm the second coming or something. I can't remember, but then he's mythologized and people are actually experiencing him after he's dead. You point this out as a fan cult type of scenario. So there's a lot here, and it depends on what way you're operating. They want to say he was euhemerized. I think there was a guy who's mythologized. I think that makes more sense to me. But when you say abandoned, I guess for me, I would say it's something that we can keep talking about, because some people are going to run and go, abandon means ignore and neglect and like downplay, like what the guild might be doing to your work. You see what I'm saying? So is there a way you would want to phrase that differently when we move on?
No, I wouldn't want to phrase it differently, but I'm not interested in policing anybody's discussion. I'm not interested in throttling anyone's imagination. Yes, of course, it's important to have these discussions and talks. Yeah. And it certainly is much better than those who are arguing that every word in the Gospels is revealed by God and so on. So, no, I'm not trying to throttle Richard or anyone else. Right. Do I think that we should abandon the discussion? My own personal judgment is that I think we should, because I don't think it should have the traction that it has for some. But I'm not interested in policing anybody's intellect.
Thank you. Appreciate that. ScholarVid says, which other scholars' books examine New Testament mimesis from Greek literature?
Some of my own students have written things. For example, Ruben Dupertuis did a wonderful dissertation on the so-called communist passages in the Acts of the Apostles, where everyone is sharing their goods and so on, with the tradition of reinterpreting Plato's Republic, where the guardians are to have everything in common. It's a very important work. Richard Miller has written a wonderful book on the resurrection stories and empty tomb stories in Greco-Roman antiquity. Probably the one who's picked up the gauntlet most recently is Michael Kochenash, whom you've had on MythVision, and I hope you have him on again. Who's done several wonderful treatises, especially on the Acts of the Apostles and the Aeneid, and how he's found things that I missed in my own work. And I wrote 3 books on the Acts of the Apostles. So, by the way, I want to say one more thing. My work is a pioneering work. It is not the last word. And some of my parallels are not going to be convincing, and others are going to be even more so. So what I'm enjoying so much about this conversation is that people are not willing simply to say MacDonald's right. They're willing to say, maybe MacDonald's pointing in the right direction. I'm going to pursue it. I'm going to ask about what are the parallels to this or that.
Thank you so much, ScholarVid, for that super chat. And everybody, I just posted how you can get his books on Amazon. He's working on the upcoming, the volumes that are going to compile, like literally take all of his works, and this isn't even all his books, and try to put them all into 2 volumes, covering everything, even updated material that isn't in some of these works, because some of these works go back to the 90s. I mean, like, you're talking... some of the stuff's way back there. And I was just a little kid when they came out. So I'm excited to see what you keep bringing, Dennis. They can go to that link I just sent in the chat and get your books. I have not read all of them. I know for a fact that when I read more, I'm going to be producing more documentary type style videos to kind of poetically get people latched onto the myth, and that there's something of value here. And I think it will help both sides, people who are atheists and skeptics who are not fans of fundamentalism, and Christians who aren't necessarily radical fundamentalists, to find a middle ground and say, stories have powerful lessons, and there's something deep about narratives. Maybe we can meet in the middle. And of course, for me, I love seeing the Greek and the Hebrew Bible connect. The New Testament is the perfect way of marrying both of these literary, cultural volumes of work. And I just think that you do such a fantastic job with all of that. Would you like to comment before I move on?
I'm really so humbled that people are paying this kind of attention. And I'm grateful for all of the questions. They are so smart. And I just encourage people to have the same fun with these texts. But it's not just fun for me. I find myself nurtured by them ethically. And what these authors are trying to do is, I find to be really admirable. I think it's a pity that most Christians have not understood the moral contours of these authors and have boiled it down to salvation by faith or something like that, when I really think that these texts have so much more to say.
Thank you so much, Dennis. If you're wanting to help out more, you can go to my Patreon and you can harass me. There's this little button here for messages, and we can chit chat. And I'd love to know more. And when I go to interview some of these academics too, especially in person, I try to get your questions. In fact, there's, I don't know how many, I think 40 or 50, maybe almost 60 videos with you and then Richard Carrier, and then you and Richard Carrier. So you get to get 2 different ideas and minds. Sometimes they cooperate, sometimes they disagree. such a friendly discussions on the Patreon, because we get to hang out at your cabin in California. And it was an experience that I will always remember, and I hope we get to do it again, Dennis, and record like this. But my Patrons have access to ask questions, and then a video comes out, high definition, where you get to ask your question. Also, I have a fundraiser. Did you want to comment on that last statement there?
No.
Okay. I've got an Israel fundraiser. I'm trying to go to Israel in October with Dr. Tabor. Some of the things I'm personally looking forward to will be actually sitting on the throne seat of Pontius Pilate. Dr. Tabor said this will be an experience that will be a wonderful, life-changing. You actually get to put the place to the kind of narratives that you're reading. And here's Pontius Pilate, where he sat and would have probably sat when he said, Jesus is being condemned. Now, this is real history, but the narrative has it. I wash my hands, of course. So there's a lot here. I'm excited to go looking at some of the sites where Jesus would have been, if you grant that this is a kernel of history here, talking about it. And I want to go and film those spots and get a lot of videos for YouTube. So please consider that, as well as the In the Beginning courses that I have with Bart Ehrman. This is recently launched. You want to know he has a 6-lecture course here where he talks about like the most common, interesting questions we have. Why are there people when Cain's afraid of people? Where did this happen? Well, why? I thought there's only 3 people on planet Earth in Genesis, and on and on and on. All sorts of questions come up about Genesis, but how to read and understand what's going on in the Hebrew Bible. Those are down in the description as well. Dennis, I had to do that plug as we're on our way out. The audience is listening. There's 200 people on Facebook and YouTube right now listening to you. What would you like to tell them?
Follow your conscience. To be open to the world, to explore, to imagine. Every day I read something that that in my date book that's called Create Something Beautiful. And we live in an ugly world right now. And I think the appreciation of literature and history and mythology is a part of creating beauty. So I would like to treat the people that have talked to me like I treat my children and say, create something beautiful today.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Everybody in the chat, we love you. Non-believer, Mitch, I see you in here. None, William Graves, Soren, Jojo, vaguely agnostic, anarcho-republican, Rochester, Darren, Scholarvid, you name it. Everybody in the chat, we really appreciate you being here. Hit the like button, of course, on your way out. I want to have Dennis come back. I don't know about you, but there's so much we didn't talk about. And I wouldn't want him to croak on the camera with us. It's just literally, if I did not say no more super chats, Dennis, I'm telling you, people will keep coming in, and I got people angry at me. So I'm trying to not create that problem where people are asking questions and then you have to go and you're like, I got to make this the last one. I just didn't want that to happen in the middle of people who are helping fork out to make the show possible. So thank you so much. And with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you know this, but we are MythVision. Don't go anywhere, Dennis.
Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.